January 11, 1944. 26,000 feet above western Germany. The air is thin enough to burn the lungs. Frost crawls across the inside of plexiglass windows. 4 Wright Cyclone engines roar in uneven harmony, each vibration traveling through aluminum ribs already weakened by battle. Below, the landscape is hidden beneath cloud and smoke. Ahead, black bursts begin to bloom, flak shells detonating with mechanical precision. Each explosion sends shards of steel outward at supersonic speed. They tear through wings, shatter control cables, rip open fuselages. A B-17 in the high squadron takes a direct hit. The blast punches a hole the size of a doorway through its left wing. Fuel streams into the slipstream. One engine flames out, another coughs. From the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 closing from the sun, a German pilot watches, waiting for the inevitable spiral, the break from formation, the fall. But it doesn't come. The bomber lurches, drops several hundred feet, then steadies. The formation tightens around it. Gunners swing their turrets. The damaged aircraft stays airborne, grinding forward toward its target as if refusing the logic of physics. Over the radio, Luftwaffe pilots report the same thing again and again. Direct hits, broken wings, fires extinguished by altitude and speed. And still, the American bombers keep flying. What German airmen are witnessing in these skies is not luck. It is the collision between expectation and a machine built to endure what no one believed it could. And to understand how this moment became possible, we have to step back to the ideas, assumptions, and brutal lessons that shaped the air war long before these bombers ever crossed the Rhine. Long before American bombers appeared over Germany in force, air power theorists were already fighting a war on paper. In the aftermath of the First World War, military planners across Europe and the United States searched for meaning in the devastation they had witnessed. The trenches had consumed millions. Artillery had dominated battlefields. But above it all, aircraft had hinted at something new, a way to strike directly at an enemy's heart. By the 1930s, this idea had hardened into doctrine. Strategic bombing, its advocates claimed, could bypass armies entirely. Factories, rail yards, power stations, oil refineries, destroy these, and a nation would collapse from within. Wars could be shortened, casualties reduced, victory achieved from the air. In the United States, this belief took institutional form at the Air Corps Tactical School in Alabama. Instructors there argued that heavily armed bombers flying in tight formations could defend themselves. Fighters with limited range and light armament would be unable to break through coordinated defensive fire. Precision bombing, conducted in daylight, would allow crews to identify and destroy specific industrial targets. Morality and efficiency, they believed, could coexist at altitude. This theory demanded a very specific kind of aircraft. The result was the Boeing B-17. Introduced in the late 1930s, the B-17 Flying Fortress was designed around survivability. It was not fast by fighter standards, it was not agile, but it was robust. 4 engines instead of 2. Redundant systems for hydraulics, electrics, and flight controls, a thick wing spar capable of absorbing punishment, and, most visibly, an unprecedented concentration of defensive machine guns. By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, the B-17 was still evolving. Early models were underarmed and underprotected, but the concept remained unchanged. Bombers would fly in formations that overlapped fields of fire, creating a moving fortress in the sky. Reality arrived quickly and violently. In 1942, the 8th Air Force began daylight bombing operations from bases in England. Targets were limited at first: occupied France, coastal installations, submarine pens. Even so, losses mounted. German fighters exploited gaps in formations. Flak batteries, already battle-hardened, proved far more accurate than expected. The Luftwaffe had been preparing for this moment for years. Germany's air defense network was layered and methodical. Early warning radar stations along the coast fed information to fighter control centers. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned in dense belts around key cities and industrial zones. Interceptor squadrons trained specifically to attack bombers. Head-on passes, concentrated cannon fire, coordinated assaults. By late 1942, it was clear that daylight bombing over Germany itself would be something entirely different. Still, the United States pressed forward. American leadership believed that bomber losses, while heavy, were acceptable. Statistical models suggested that formations would survive long enough to break the enemy's war economy. Crews were told that completing a tour, 25 missions at first, was achievable. The aircraft, they were assured, could take punishment and bring them home. As 1933 began, targets moved deeper inland: Ruhr factories, ball bearing plants, aircraft assembly lines. And with each mile east, the theory of the flying fortress would face its most unforgiving test, because waiting beyond the coast was an enemy who had learned, adapted, and prepared, and who fully expected these bombers to fall from the sky once the real fighting began. By the time American bombers began pushing deep into German airspace in 1943, the Luftwaffe was no longer improvising. It was executing a system refined through years of war. At its core was integration. Radar stations along the North Sea and Atlantic coast detected incoming bomber streams while they were still forming over England. Plotters tracked altitude, heading, and speed. This information flowed to regional fighter control centers, where commanders calculated interception points minutes in advance. Squadrons were scrambled, not in haste, but with purpose. Below, the Flak waited. Germany had invested heavily in anti-aircraft artillery long before the first American bombs fell. The backbone of this defense was the 8.8-centimeter Flak gun, accurate, deadly, and capable of reaching bombers at operational altitude. Around major cities, these guns were massed in batteries of dozens, sometimes hundreds, tied together by optical rangefinders and centralized fire control. Later, proximity fuses increased lethality even further. Flak did not need to score a direct hit. A shell detonating near a bomber sent razor-sharp fragments through aluminum skin, fuel tanks, control surfaces, and crew compartments. One burst could sever oxygen lines, blind gunners, or ignite fires. Even aircraft that survived the barrage often emerged wounded, trailing smoke, losing altitude, struggling to stay in formation. This was where German fighter pilots expected the kill. Luftwaffe doctrine taught that bombers were most vulnerable once damaged. A lone aircraft, lagging behind the formation, became a magnet for attack. Fighters armed with 20mm and 30mm cannons could tear through wings and fuselages in seconds. A single burst, delivered accurately, was often enough to finish the job. From the cockpit of a Focke-Wulf FW-190 or Messerschmitt Bf-109, the B-17 looked enormous, slow, predictable. And yet, something began to unsettle these assumptions. Combat reports from early 1943 started to show a pattern. Bombers struck repeatedly by flak were not always breaking away. Aircraft hit by cannon fire sometimes continued on course. Engines burned out, but the aircraft stayed airborne. Crews feathered propellers, rerouted power, shifted fuel, and held formation with grim determination. German pilots noted it with confusion. Some described firing at aircraft that were already visibly crippled, only to watch them absorb the impact and keep flying. Others reported bombers returning fire after turrets were damaged and crew wounded. There were instances where a B-17 lost part of a wingtip or sections of tailplane and still maintained control. The reason lay partly in design. The B-17 was over-engineered by pre-war standards. It could fly on 3 engines, sometimes 2. Control cables were doubled or tripled. Hydraulic systems had manual backups. The wing's internal structure allowed damage to be localized rather than catastrophic. Fires, while terrifying, were often starved of oxygen at high altitude or extinguished by airflow. But design alone did not explain everything. American formations adapted. Bombers flew in increasingly tight combat boxes, overlapping arcs of fire so that attacking fighters were met with walls of 50 caliber machine gun fire. A German pilot approaching head-on had seconds to aim before flying into a converging storm of bullets. Losses mounted on both sides. For the Luftwaffe, the expectation had been clear: massed bomber formations would shatter under sustained attack. Instead, they endured. They bled, but they continued to reach their targets, release their bombs, and turn for home. By mid-1943, a troubling realization began to take hold among German airmen and commanders alike. These bombers were not behaving as planned. They were not collapsing under pressure. They were absorbing punishment that should have destroyed them, and in doing so, they were forcing the air war into a far more brutal, personal struggle than anyone had anticipated. That struggle would be defined not just by machines, but by the people inside them, and by the moment-to-moment choices made under fire. And it is through those different perspectives that the story now tightens. For the men inside a B-17, survival was never abstract. It was mechanical, immediate, personal. At cruising altitude, temperatures plunged to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Oxygen masks were mandatory. Frostbite was a constant threat. The aircraft was unpressurized, unheated, and loud enough to cause permanent hearing damage. Every mission meant hours sealed inside a vibrating aluminum shell, knowing that at any moment it could be torn open. When flak hit, there was no warning, no incoming whistle, no time to brace. A sudden concussion would slam through the airframe. Shrapnel tore through bulkheads and flesh alike. Gunners were often the first hit, exposed behind plexiglass blisters. Pilots felt the controls go slack or stiffen without explanation. The smell of burning oil or hydraulic fluids spread instantly. And yet, crews stayed at their stations. Bombardiers continued to track targets through cracked Norden sights. Engineers fought fires with handheld extinguishers, crawling through smoke-filled compartments. Radio operators doubled as medics, applying morphine and bandages while still relaying messages. If one man went down, another stepped into his position without orders. This was not heroism in the abstract. It was procedure drilled into muscle memory. The aircraft itself demanded it. A single abandoned position could leave a blind spot. One lapse could invite a fighter attack. So even when wounded, even when the aircraft was barely controllable, the crew acted as if the mission still mattered, because it did. From the inside, a B-17 that kept flying was not defying physics. It was being held together by training, discipline, and men who understood that stopping meant falling, and falling meant death. For Luftwaffe pilots, bomber interception was supposed to be decisive. They approached at high speed, often from head-on, where defensive fire was weakest. The closure rate was immense, over 600 miles per hour combined. In those few seconds, pilots aimed for cockpit, engines, or wing roots. A solid hit usually meant structural failure, but increasingly, it didn't. Pilots reported firing full cannon bursts into B-17s, only to see them continue straight and level. They watched engines disintegrate while the aircraft held formation. Some described bombers that should have been unflyable, tails shredded, noses smashed, still releasing bombs with precision. This was deeply unsettling.
Fighter pilots were trained to read damage instinctively. Smoke, flame, debris, these were cues that a kill was imminent. When those cues failed, confidence eroded. Attacks had to be repeated. Each pass meant flying again through concentrated defensive fire. Each pass raised the risk. Veterans began to describe the bombers as indestructible, not as exaggeration, but as an expression of disbelief. The machines violated expectations. They did not react as theory said they should. And in aerial combat, uncertainty was deadly. The B-17's endurance was not accidental. American designers had prioritized redundancy over elegance. Flight control cables were routed along different paths so a single hit would not sever them all. Fuel tanks were self-sealing. Engines were spaced widely apart to prevent cascading failures. Structural members were thick, heavy, and forgiving under stress. The aircraft could absorb damage unevenly. A wing might lose lift on one side, but still generate enough on the other to maintain control. Trim tabs compensated. Pilots adjusted power constantly, fighting asymmetry with skill learned through brutal experience. German engineers understood these principles. What shocked them was how completely they had been implemented. This was not a fragile machine optimized for performance. It was a platform built to be hit and to keep flying afterward. And as these angles converged, human endurance, enemy disbelief, and mechanical resilience, the air war began to change character. The question was no longer whether bombers could reach their targets, it was how long either side could endure the cost of proving it. That question would now be tested at the highest levels of command and conscience.
At command level, the resilience of the B-17 created a dangerous paradox. American air planners watched damaged bombers return to England with missing sections of fuselage, holes punched clean through wings, and wounded crews still alive. These aircraft became proof points, evidence that the doctrine worked. Charts showed bombers surviving hits that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Confidence hardened. But beneath that confidence was arithmetic. Even when aircraft survived, crews did not always. A bomber that limped home might carry 2 dead, 3 wounded, in a traumatized crew unlikely to fly again soon. Losses were counted not just in aircraft destroyed, but in men exhausted, injured, or quietly broken by repetition. Commanders like Ira Eaker and Karl Spaatz faced relentless pressure. Pause the bombing campaign, and Germany's industry recovered. Push forward, and casualties mounted. The B-17's durability made it possible to continue, but it also made it easier to accept sustained losses as the price of progress. In German headquarters, a similar calculation unfolded. Each bomber that refused to fall forced another interception, another scramble, another engagement that cost fuel, aircraft, and trained pilots Germany could not easily replace. The Flying Fortress did not need to be invincible, it only needed to be durable enough to shift the balance of exhaustion. The Luftwaffe responded with innovation born of desperation. Tactics evolved rapidly. Fighters attacked from head-on to minimize exposure time. Heavy cannons were introduced to deliver greater destructive force per hit. Specialized units trained exclusively for bomber interception. Some pilots experimented with firing rockets from outside defensive gun range. None of it restored certainty. The bomber formations adapted just as quickly. Gunners learned lead and convergence through experience. Crews coordinated fire discipline. Damaged aircraft were shepherded by others, protected until they could break away near the coast. German pilots found themselves engaging not individual aircraft, but systems, interlocking formations that punished mistakes instantly. The longer a bomber stayed airborne after taking damage, the more dangerous it became to finish off. This reversed the psychological dynamic of the fight. The hunter was now exposed. There was also a quieter angle, one rarely recorded in official reports. For German pilots, watching a bomber refuse to die carried a human cost. Through shattered plexiglass, they could see figures inside, men moving, firing, fighting fires. These were not anonymous machines, they were crews visibly struggling to survive. Some pilots later recalled breaking off attacks not because they lacked ammunition, but because the image stayed with them. A burning aircraft that held formation challenged not just tactical assumptions, but emotional ones. For American crews, endurance became identity. The battered aircraft that landed became symbols on base. Crowds gathered to count the holes, to touch the torn metal, to reassure themselves that survival was possible. These moments fed belief, belief that the aircraft could take it, belief that the mission mattered, belief that if they held on long enough, the enemy would break first. That belief would soon be tested in a series of missions where damage, loss, and disbelief reached their absolute peak, raids that forced both sides to confront the limits of endurance in the most unforgiving airspace of the war.
The test came in the autumn of 1943. By then, the air war over Europe had narrowed to a brutal equation. American bombers would strike the core of German industry in daylight. The Luftwaffe would stop them, or be ground down trying. On August 17, 1943, that equation was written into history over two targets, Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The plan was ambitious. Two separate bomber forces would strike deep into Germany, hitting aircraft factories and ball-bearing plants critical to German war production. The formations would not rendezvous. They would fly beyond the range of available fighter escort. Surprise and speed were expected to compensate. They did not. As the bombers crossed the German border, the sky ahead darkened with flak. Batteries ringed the targets in layered belts. Bursts walked methodically through formations, adjusting with lethal accuracy. Aircraft were hit before German fighters even arrived. Then the interceptors came. Waves of Bf-109s and Fw-190s attacked from head-on, firing cannon shells designed to rip bombers apart in a single pass. Some pilots carried under-wing gun pods, others close to point-blank range, the air filled with debris, metal, fabric, glass, bodies. And yet, again and again, the expected collapses did not come. A B-17 from the 100th Bomb Group lost 2 engines over Schweinfurt. Its nose was shattered. The bombardier lay wounded. The pilot maintained altitude by sheer force of control input, the aircraft skidding through the air but staying aloft long enough to drop its bombs. Another aircraft took a flak burst directly through the fuselage. The explosion severed oxygen lines and killed the waist gunner instantly. Fires broke out near the wing root. The engineer crawled through smoke to extinguish them while the aircraft remained in formation. German pilots reported firing repeated bursts into bombers that continued straight, level, and armed. The cost was staggering. Of the 376 bombers dispatched, 60 were lost. Hundreds of airmen were killed or captured. Entire crews vanished into German fields and forests. The missions were officially labeled successes, but the price shook American leadership. And yet, something else emerged from the wreckage. Despite catastrophic damage, dozens of aircraft returned to England that should not have. Bombers landed with wings barely attached, control surfaces missing, landing gear locked down by hand cranks while wounded crews bled into the fuselage floor. Photographs of these aircraft circulated rapidly. They were studied, measured, and quietly absorbed into Doctrine. For the Luftwaffe, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids marked a different realization. Even when the defense worked, when losses were extreme, the bombers still reached their targets. They still dropped their payloads. They still came back in numbers that defied pre-war expectations. German pilots had done everything theory demanded, and it was not enough. As 1943 turned toward winter, the air battles intensified. Berlin became a repeated target. Each raid followed a familiar pattern: flak damage, fighter attacks, aircraft crippled yet refusing to fall until bombs were away. One German pilot summarized the shift in a combat report after a November engagement over Berlin. The enemy aircraft remain operational after damage that should render them uncontrollable. That sentence echoed through Luftwaffe command channels, because by now it was no longer an isolated observation. It was a pattern, and patterns, in war, force decisions. The next phase of the air war would hinge on whether Germany could increase the cost fast enough, or whether the flying fortress had already crossed a threshold where endurance itself became decisive. That threshold would soon be tested under new conditions, with new forces entering the sky.
By early 1944, the air war reached a breaking point. The Luftwaffe had refined every available method of bomber destruction. Interceptor groups were concentrated along likely routes, flak belts were reinforced, new weapons, air-to-air rockets, heavier cannon, specialized bomber-destroyer units were deployed with urgency. Still, the bombers kept coming. On January 11, 1944, the same day whose aftermath would be studied for years, over 600 American bombers crossed into Germany, bound for aircraft production centers. The targets were known, the routes were anticipated, the defenders were ready. What followed was one of the largest aerial engagements of the war. Flak began bursting at the outer edges of the formations, then thickened as the bombers approached their targets. Entire squadrons flew through black clouds of explosions, emerging damaged but intact. German fighters attacked relentlessly, pressing home head-on passes despite the lethal defensive fire. It was here that disbelief turned into something deeper. German pilots reported bombers continuing flight with entire sections of wing skin stripped away. Others watched aircraft lose engines in flames, only for the fires to die out as the bomber pressed forward. Several pilots noted firing at the same aircraft multiple times during the same mission, unable to finish it. Then came the shift. Long-range Allied escort fighters, P-51 Mustangs and extended-range P-47s, now accompanied the bombers deep into Germany. These fighters did not merely defend, they hunted, they pursued German interceptors before they could form up, they attacked airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground. For the Luftwaffe, this was catastrophic. Fighter losses mounted rapidly. Veteran pilots, irreplaceable, were killed at rates Germany could no longer sustain. Fuel shortages limited training hours. Replacement pilots arrived with minimal experience, thrown into combat against formations that had already proven their resilience. The bombers, meanwhile, continued to demonstrate the same pattern. They took damage, they lost aircraft, they kept flying. The turning point was not a single battle or raid, it was a realization. German commanders recognized that even perfect interception no longer guaranteed success. Bombers no longer needed to be stopped completely to achieve strategic effect. As long as enough survived to deliver bombs, the mission succeeded, and the cost to German defenses grew unsustainable. Reports from early 1944 reflected a change in tone. Where earlier documents spoke of tactics and solutions, newer ones spoke of shortages, fatigue, and inevitability. The flying fortress had not made the Luftwaffe irrelevant, but it had forced it into a war of attrition it could not win. By the spring, Allied escort fighters ranged almost at will across the Reich. Aircraft factories were hit repeatedly. Oil production plummeted. Transportation networks fractured. German pilots still fought with courage and skill, but increasingly they fought knowing that the bombers they damaged might still survive, and that every attack exposed them to growing danger. The sky itself had changed sides. What German pilots once expected, to see bombers fall in flames after decisive hits, had become uncertain, even rare. The endurance of the B-17, amplified by escort and numbers, had shifted the balance irreversibly.
The climax of disbelief gave way to consequence. Because the bombers that kept flying did more than survive, they reshaped the outcome of the war in the air. And when the fighting finally moved beyond the skies, the effects of that endurance became impossible to ignore.
When the smoke cleared from the skies over Germany, the numbers told a stark story. Between 1942 and the end of the war, the United States Army Air Forces lost over 4,700 B-17s in combat. More than 26,000 American airmen flying heavy bombers were killed. These figures alone suggest vulnerability, not invincibility. But the comparison mattered more than the total. For the Luftwaffe, the cost of stopping those bombers proved catastrophic. Fighter losses escalated sharply after early 1944, particularly among experienced pilots. By mid-year, Germany was losing trained aircrew faster than it could replace them. Fuel shortages compounded the crisis, limiting training flights and operational readiness. New pilots arrived at the front with minimal hours, sometimes fewer than 100, facing opponents who had already survived multiple combat tours. The endurance of the bombers forced this imbalance. Each B-17 that absorbed damage and stayed airborne demanded continued engagement. Fighters expended ammunition, engines burned fuel, pilots risked their lives again and again. When the smoke cleared from the skies over Germany, the numbers told a stark story. Between 1942 and the end of the war, the United States Army Air Forces lost over 4,700 B-17s in combat. More than 26,000 American airmen flying heavy bombers were killed. These figures alone suggest vulnerability, not invincibility. But the comparison mattered more than the total. For the Luftwaffe, the cost of stopping those bombers proved catastrophic. Fighter losses escalated sharply after early 1944, particularly among experienced pilots. By mid-year, Germany was losing trained aircrew faster than it could replace them. Fuel shortages compounded the crisis, limiting training flights and operational readiness. New pilots arrived at the front with minimal hours, sometimes fewer than 100, facing opponents who had already survived multiple combat tours. The endurance of the bombers forced this imbalance. Each B-17 that absorbed damage and stayed airborne demanded continued engagement. Fighters expended ammunition, engines burned fuel, pilots risked their lives again and again in repeated attacks. Even successful interceptions often came at a cost that favored the attacker only in isolation. On the ground, the effects were equally severe. Despite heavy defenses, American bombers struck German industry with growing frequency and precision. Aircraft production facilities were damaged repeatedly. Ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, and synthetic fuel complexes suffered sustained attacks. Repair crews worked continuously, but recovery windows narrowed with each raid. The psychological toll was impossible to quantify, but widely acknowledged. German civilians lived under constant threat. Air raid sirens became routine. Industrial workers faced repeated disruptions, shortages, and exhaustion. The belief that the Reich's defenses could stop the bombers eroded steadily. Among Luftwaffe pilots, morale fractured unevenly. Some veterans continued to fight with determination, adapting tactics and mentoring younger pilots. Others recognized the trajectory and flew with a grim sense of inevitability. Combat reports from late 1944 reveal resignation as much as resistance, acknowledgement that the bombers, even when damaged, were achieving their purpose. Meanwhile, in England, the returning aircraft told their own story. Damaged B-17s lined airfields, patched and repaired between missions. Crews walked past them daily, counting holes, studying twisted metal. These aircraft became physical evidence of survival. They reinforced belief not in invulnerability,
but in endurance. That belief mattered. It sustained the bombing campaign through its most costly months. It justified continued pressure when losses were hardest to bear. And it shaped the strategic confidence that Allied planners carried into the final year of the war. Yet endurance came at a price beyond statistics. The men who flew these missions carried scars, physical and psychological, that lasted long after the engines fell silent. Survivors spoke later of the constant tension, the sound of flak, the sight of damaged aircraft slipping away into cloud, and never returning. The bombers that kept flying changed the war's trajectory, but they also defined a generation marked by altitude, cold, and the relentless logic of industrial conflict. Those marks would not fade when the fighting ended. They would shape how the war was remembered and how air power itself would be understood in the decades that followed.
As the war moved toward its conclusion, the long shadow of the bomber campaign stretched far beyond the ruins of German cities. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer a force capable of sustained resistance in the air. Aircraft production, once a symbol of German industrial strength, struggled against shortages of fuel, materials, and trained labor. Even when new fighters rolled off assembly lines, there were often no experienced pilots to fly them, and no fuel to train those who remained. The bombers that had refused to fall played a direct role in this collapse. Oil targets proved decisive. Repeated attacks on synthetic fuel plants crippled Germany's ability to operate mechanized forces. Tanks sat idle, aircraft were grounded, training flights were canceled. The endurance of the bomber formations, surviving flak, fighters, and weather made these sustained attacks possible. For Allied planners, the lesson was clear. Survivability mattered as much as firepower. The B-17's ability to absorb damage and still deliver bombs validated the pre-war emphasis on redundancy and structural strength. Future bomber designs would carry this lesson forward, blending durability with speed, altitude, and electronic countermeasures. But there was also a quieter reckoning. Post-war interviews with German pilots often returned to the same theme: surprise, frustration, respect. Many acknowledged that the bombers' refusal to fall altered how they understood air combat. The enemy was no longer a fragile intruder to be shattered quickly, but a persistent presence that demanded sacrifice with diminishing returns. American veterans, too, reflected on endurance with mixed emotions. They remembered the pride of bringing a damaged aircraft home and the guilt of seeing others fail to return. They spoke of the aircraft as both shield and burden, a machine that protected them, but also carried them repeatedly into danger because it could. Historians would later debate the effectiveness and morality of the bombing campaign. They would analyze tonnage dropped, factories destroyed, civilian casualties incurred. Those debates continue. What remains undisputed is the transformation of aerial warfare. The sight that once shocked German pilots, bombers flying on after damage that should have destroyed them, became a defining image of industrial war. It demonstrated that resilience could be engineered, trained, and institutionalized, that machines, when designed for survival and operated by disciplined crews, could reshape strategic reality. When the war ended in May 1945, thousands of B-17s sat idle on airfields across Europe. Many would be scrapped, others repurposed. Their wartime scars would be smelted away, their stories carried only by the men who flew them. Yet the idea they embodied endured. The belief that endurance, measured not in moments but in sustained pressure, could decide conflicts where speed and elegance failed. And it is in that belief that the final meaning of the Flying Fortress begins to emerge. High above Europe, the B-17 did not win the air war through perfection. It won it through persistence. The German pilots who watched these bombers absorb flak, survive cannon fire, and continue toward their targets were witnessing the limits of expectation.
They had been trained to read damage, to recognize the moment an aircraft was finished. When that moment failed to arrive, certainty dissolved, and with it, control of the sky. The flying fortress was not indestructible. Thousands were destroyed. Tens of thousands of men did not return. But the aircraft altered the equation by refusing to behave as fragile machines were supposed to. It endured long enough, often just barely, to deliver its purpose. That endurance carried a human cost on both sides. For the crews inside, survival depended on discipline, repetition, and the willingness to function under constant threat. For those who tried to stop them, it demanded escalating sacrifice for diminishing results. In the end, the B-17's legacy is not found in a single raid or statistic. It is found in the quiet realization that war, at its most industrial, is shaped less by moments of brilliance than by systems that can endure punishment without collapsing. The flying fortress became one such system. Metal, doctrine, and human resolve fused together at altitude. When German pilots reported bombers that should not still be flying, they were describing more than damaged aircraft. They were describing a shift in warfare itself, a moment when resilience, engineered, trained, and sustained, proved decisive. And when the engines finally fell silent, that lesson remained, etched into the history of the sky.